Hello, I'm Michelle Farley, President of FCS Fire Consulting Services Limited, a fire code consulting firm specializing in fire code compliance, planning implementation, and ULC standards participation and implementation for more than 25 years. Whether you're a developer, facility manager, building engineer, or property manager, you will learn something new today. Fines are on the rise, insurance is on the rise, and mitigating risk is the primary agenda of all building professionals. We are here to discuss keeping your buildings and your people safe. The presentation is not to be interpreted as advice. It is general in nature and for information purposes only. Fire code compliance, fire code maintenance, and fire code enforcement have dramatically changed over the past few years, and there are many new changes that affect existing and new buildings. Before we talk about what's new, let's talk about why we're here. You want to protect your assets, your people, and to mitigate your risks. The Ontario Fire Code and the National Fire Code clearly state that the owner is responsible for addressing fire code requirements in their building. It goes on to define owner as any person or corporation having control over a building. That definition of owner extends to all building operators, facility and property managers, boards of directors, and any persons with a fiduciary responsibility to care for the fire code compliance in your buildings. We all strive to be in compliance. So why do we see so many fire department inspections and orders? The fire code is a complex document that evolves regularly and requires application and training to specific buildings, systems, and supervisory staff limitations and budgets to be effective. From the planning and final building permit clearance of a building to the ongoing fire code management, we need to take a more holistic approach to ensure all buildings are safe. My main focus today is your practical and sustainable fire code compliance, maintenance, and enforcement. More than 50% of the fire code is not the responsibility of your fire alarm and life safety system service providers. Navigating changing standards is essential to building management. Today's presentation will be broken down into 3 sections. So let's start with fire code compliance. Changes to the fire code, changes to ULC life safety system inspection standards, new enforcement procedures by local fire departments, and a brand new ULC standard have improved the fire safety of our buildings, but swiftly increase the need to increase fire code management knowledge. We also are building far higher and more complex buildings, making these challenges even greater for managers coming into a new building that they're not familiar with. I've been presenting fire code compliance sessions since the early 1980s. In that time, buildings have become more complex, the fire code has evolved, and today we're going to review recent fire code changes and compliance enforcement. As the president of FCS, focusing on fire code compliance in buildings and condominiums for over 25 years, I have participated in and scrutinized new complexities within the fire code and how they apply to retrofit and new buildings. It is becoming more difficult for service companies to disseminate the requirements within the scope of their inspection contracts. 20 years ago, the fire and building codes were revised in 5-year cycles, and new changes were generally only applicable at those times. The codes and standards now utilize the term of maintenance documents, and technical bulletins may be issued within 2 to 3 years of the last changes, and sometimes at any time if something arises. I recently reviewed the latest ULC bulletin, and it has changes to 6 ULC standards, 4 of which may directly impact your buildings, including CAN S536, the annual fire alarm test standard. This increases the challenge of sifting through what applies to your building and what does not. Whether you're managing a new or aging building, the fire code requires annual review of your fire safety plan and fire code obligations outside of your annual inspections. This has become imperative to prevent fire department inspection orders and maintain fire code compliance. We know you're always going to arrange your annual tests, and that you and your contractors are doing your best to ensure you meet your obligations. It's very hard to keep up with all changes, and this is reflected in the huge volume of notices of violations and inspection orders we are seeing in good buildings doing a good job. Don't try to be a fire code expert. Manage what you can with your staff and your qualified contractors, but ask for expert help when it comes to compliance and proving you're not just fire alarm testing compliant, but also fire code compliant. This is about life safety, and most fire departments are now inspecting buildings annually. They are not just looking for your annual records, they are looking for complete fire code compliance. We're going to review a few examples of changing fire code requirements that are showing up in many notices of violations, even when managers and contractors thought they were compliant, with a practical focus on how these changing codes, standards, and enforcement protocols are emphasizing gaps in your fire code compliance initiatives. With proper compliance initiatives from contractors through to supervisory staff, management and implementation of a building-specific fire safety plan, training, and professional annual review, no building should ever face an inspection order or notice of violation, or worse, a loss of property or life. We talked about changes to the fire codes. Let me show you how what looks like relatively small revisions to a section of the fire code will impact your building. Most buildings have a standpipe system, a systematic system of piping from the top to the base of the building connected to the road or a water supply, where you have your fire hoses and your fire hose cabinets connected. Let's have a look at how a subtle recent change has caused both interpretation and enforcement challenges. When a fire code change occurs, the change may apply to an entire section of the fire code or may have select section changes, as with 6431 standpipe systems. In July 2018, parts of the standpipe section, which is within Part 6 of the fire code, changed. The actual section 6431 remained unchanged. However, further related sections in Part 6 did change, and a requirement was added. So how does this affect your building? 6433 added a subtle change. This statement became prescriptive, where your service contractor would simply annually test the standpipe system in the same manner as the remainder of your system in the previous version of the fire code section. The code now prescribed shall be hydrostatically tested. Your typical flow testing has the contractor flow water and record the readings. Hydrostatic testing requires extensive pressure testing for a long period of time of the piping with special equipment. This is not a typical test conducted by all contractors. This change to an additional requirement of periodic hydrostatic testing has code impact to your buildings further on in this section. 6433 added a subtle change. This statement became prescriptive. This all comes together in 6437, subsection 2. As of July 1st, 2018, if the fire department connection piping has not been hydrostatically tested within the previous 5 years, or you do not have a record of this testing you can produce to the fire department, then the hydrostatic testing was required to be done before January 1, 2019. We have resolved several notices of violation, often after good money being spent on the wrong tests by contractors because this section was not known or it was misunderstood. Here's the bottom line. If your building does not have the 5-year hydrostatic test record and you did not do this test yet, you are in violation of this section of the fire code. When we conduct our annual fire code reviews at buildings, we regularly find this testing has not been conducted and no record is available. This lack of record is a violation of the fire code and can result in a notice of violation. Changes to the fire code are enforceable within your building, whether your service providers stay current or not. In addition to the fire code changes, the Underwriters Laboratory of Canada, or UL standards, improve as well. So how do changes to the standards affect your building? The fire code states that your life safety systems are to be tested and generally referenced a requirement or standard that you and your contractors are required to adhere to. You're likely familiar with emergency power systems having to be tested per CSA, sprinkler and standpipe and extinguishers to be tested according to NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, fire alarm testing as per ULC S536. These all change. Each code, standard, and reference requirement are on their own cycle of maintenance and changes. Recent changes that are likely to affect your new and existing buildings are regularly published. Recent changes you should be aware of, and some which have become mandatory within 2020, include the following. CAN ULC S524 2019 was updated. It's the installation of fire alarm systems. These changes primarily affect new buildings. CAN ULC S524 2027 control units for fire alarm systems. These changes primarily affect new buildings as well. But ULC S536 was revised in 2019. Inspection and testing of fire alarm systems, and in addition, CAN ULC S524 verification of fire alarm systems will affect both new and fire alarm retrofitted projects in all buildings, new and old. These are likely to be the most substantial changes that will affect your annual inspections and may affect your budgets. A relatively new standard is CAN ULC S590. This is the design, installation, inspection, and testing and maintenance of safety way guidance systems, often known as SWGS. It's anticipated to be referenced in the building code and may become mandatory for egress marking of new buildings or existing buildings adding guidance systems. These systems can be electric or photoluminescent, glow in the dark, and these systems may be used in buildings where there are high buildings with challenges to evacuation, or even in buildings where people may be having to use that building that have disabilities or other items that might have to have things more clearly identified. This standard talks about how you maintain and install these systems. It is already being referenced across Canada. A new standard, CAN ULC S1001, is the integrated systems testing of fire protection and life safety systems. It's a great new tool to fill the gap for individual system testings, and I think it's going to be a benefit for many, many buildings. So let's talk a little bit about this new standard. This is brand new. The new S1001 certificate requires that a ULC certified S1001 company and ULC certified coordinator signed off on the integration of all life safety systems when the building was built. When the fire alarm goes off, all life safety systems are supposed to operate in harmony. Alarms sound, fire doors open and close, elevators recall, pressurization fans come on, and the building performs as designed under emergency conditions. That's what we all want. And as of June 2020, this is now a requirement. When we do integrated system testing as a part of fire alarm diagnostic testing, tests where we're training or doing exercises or developing protocols for Part 7 of the Fire Code, we find isolated or substantial integrated failures in over 90% of the buildings we inspect. The reality is that an integrated test is rarely conducted with all life safety systems operating together in an integrated fashion. Systems are professionally designed, individually verified, certified, tested, and signed off on. But with staged occupancies, differing contractors, engineers, and design responsibilities, there's never been a standard that required a certified, systematic, integrated test until now. This test is conducted after all parties have signed off on their individual systems and before the permit is cleared. A new ULC certificate will be issued by ULC, like the certificate you would receive from ULC for monitoring systems, and has to be recertified every 5 years. This new standard will bridge the gap in buildings discovering systematic deficiencies during a performance audit or fire event. In the September 2020 issue of the CFA Journal, in an article discussing why integration testing is critical for safety, the program manager at ULC, Tess Bojo, concluded, and I quote, "The testing of the integration of fire protection and life safety systems is an overall benefit for projects, with its no-nonsense approach that will assist in validating the intended system design, performance, criteria, and proper installation and operation of these systems, ultimately intended to ensure that the building and its occupants are protected from fire." So we have new changes to codes and standards. How do we keep your buildings in compliance? FCS conducts fire code reviews in many buildings on a regular and annual contract basis. This fire code compliance review is outside the scope of any of your contracted fire alarm system, sprinkler system, or other life safety system testing. We took 1 year of our results from dozens of buildings to show you where the deficiencies tend to be, who's responsible, and why an annual fire code compliance review is essential. I have conducted fire code retrofit and general compliance audits in hundreds of buildings since the 1990s. Once deficiencies are identified, corrected, and staff trained, the reoccurrence rate reduces substantially. So what are the leading deficiencies? Where do you find most deficiencies? In almost 100 buildings audited, our fire code compliance team found common fire code deficiencies that are easily preventable by properly training supervisory staff or implementing their customized fire safety plans. You're here today because you want to make sure that you have a plan that's going to reduce the number of deficiencies in your building. Buildings age, maintenance is required, life safety systems and equipment become antiquated and require periodic review, repair, and/or replacement. What do you think the top fire deficiencies that we found, the top 5 fire code auditors found and our fire protection engineers run into every day that we found in 1 year? 95% of the buildings we audited had deficient fire door and closer latches. I took this picture at the entrance to the elevator machine room on the roof. Contractors likely disabled the door closer to move equipment or materials in or out of the room, but the building had not had any substantial work in several years. This closer had been damaged for a very long time. Door closers are generally the responsibility of supervisory staff. Properly inspected and working closers are essential to provide containment in your building. Damaged or ineffective closers, doors that don't latch or are warped or worn, or door hardware that's not functioning properly are common in stairwells and service rooms. Before we go on, let me tell you a little bit about what is a fire code audit. It's every room, every floor, every door in a building from the top to the bottom. Now, there's also sampling tests that are available as well, depending on the age and the scope of your building. But to look at each section of the fire code and each of the areas within your building, when it's scrutinized by somebody trained to understand the fire code, will help you to identify the areas where you need more protocols and training for your staff to be able to find these different areas. We generally start at the top of the building and work our way down. And in many, many occasions, do this with the supervisory staff so they can see how to conduct this type of an assessment, but also we can discuss whether these are the protocols that they're using to implement their fire safety plan. As we discussed earlier, over 50% of the fire code is a responsibility of supervisory staff, and fire doors, closers, latches throughout your building form part of those responsibilities. 93% of the buildings we audited had deficient fire separations or fire stopping. This is the second highest occurrence of deficiencies we see. In this picture, it could be that the fire separation was completed from above, but it wasn't. Further evaluation confirmed that the pipe was retrofitted at some point and the fire stopping was never restored. A fire in this mechanical room would spread to the floor area above. In a brand new condo that I audited as part of a process of training the new management and supervisory staff in their new building, I found 3 of 25 electrical closets had a substantial breach from ongoing finishing work that was still underway at the time of the building permit clearances. Even new buildings can be prone to deficiencies that have been missed or from subsequent work that may be ongoing. In another new building that I audited, substantial cuts in locker rooms and service rooms were observed after the building was completed, but were necessary due to a ventilation improvement that was made by the builder. The work was completed, ventilation was absolutely improved, but a scope of work was not prepared to refinish the fire separations and the fire stopping, leaving all of those areas vulnerable to the spread of smoke and fire. In a 30-year-old retrofit building I audited, there was a hole in every electrical closet on each common floor where years earlier phone and cable wiring had been updated. A scope of work was prepared, the holes were filled, and less than a year later, a substantial fire at the building started in an electrical closet. The fire spread through 5 floors of closets in a 33-story building. If those fire separation breaches had not been caught and repaired, the fire and smoke would have spread throughout the entire building. Maintenance, repairs, electrical, mechanical, emergency repairs often require cutting into fire separations. I've often referred to some contractors as Swiss cheese contractors. It's not their fault. In many, many cases, their scope of work does not include returning the fire separations to their original integrity or fire stopping. It's often done by others. Not sure who others are, but they're missing in a lot of the buildings that we audit. Almost every building we audit has some areas of fire separations that have been compromised and not returned to their original integrity. Again, diminishing the containment requirement where separations are damaged. 93%. "79% of the buildings we audited had deficient fire system records. Most were the records to be maintained by supervisory staff. In many cases, records and fire safety plans had also not been updated in years or to include changes to life safety systems within the building. Sprinkler system periodic testing, the original or new requirements were not listed or recorded and not readily available. Fire alarm system retrofits, new panel replacements, updated equipment, maglocks or automated emergency voice communication systems being added or retrofitted to the system at a later date were not included in the fire safety plan, or records of the changes did not form an appendix or part of the original fire safety plan. Elevator modernization has been an ongoing challenge in a lot of buildings and often is not listed as changed, for example, from a manual to an automatic system. Also, upgrades may change the annual or the quarterly requirements of the testing and inspections within that building that should be listed in your fire safety plan. CO detection additions, whether standalone or systematic, CO detection added in garages, service rooms, even residential or commercial suites are often not listed in the fire safety plan, so the staff has no way of knowing how to inspect and maintain those systems, and they're rarely listed in the documentation that we review. Part 7, smoke control, fire safety plan supplemental test protocols, and quarterly records are often not part of the fire safety plan or not being followed, sometimes not understood. The quarterly test procedures are not outlined or stamped or approved by an engineer, and worse, are often not even known but to the supervisory staff or management. 79% of the buildings we audited had deficient combustible load maintenance in one or more area of the building. When I took this picture, I was auditing a building that was only 4 years old. When I asked the supervisor why these combustible materials were stored in a room with electrical equipment, he stated that he didn't know. They were here since construction. Many areas of a building are used for storage that is not allowed in that area, has built up over time, or is not required and can pose an increased fire spread and fire load risk. We're seeing substantial notices of violation on combustible loads, on storage in areas where it doesn't belong. This includes underground garages with garbage bins. We all have to reuse, recycle. We're adding green bins, blue bins, gray bins, and more garbage in a lot of buildings. There has to be a way to properly maintain this, and the fire code and alternative solutions allow a way for us to make sure that your building is properly complying with these standards. In many cases, some of the areas that are filled with combustibles are things that have been there for years and can easily be relocated to another area or new containment created to provide a safe environment for them to be stored. In 70% of the buildings we audited, they had deficient, antiquated, or incomplete fire safety plans. Many managers choose to prepare or review the fire safety plans themselves annually, without adequate records or knowledge of the changed fire codes and standards. I have seen many fire safety plans that list systems that are not in the building. They list elevator retrieval where a building is under 6 stories and does not have that feature, where a private hydrant is on the property, but it's not listed in the plan and often not tested for years. These are easily missed, but easy to correct. Section 2.8.2.1 of the Ontario Fire Code requires your fire safety plan to be reviewed at a minimum of once per year and at intervals where updating is required. With all the changes to codes, standards, test procedures, even staff in your own building, building maintenance, and retrofit, we've talked about this, should really be conducted by a professional. But it's not just about the book. I'm talking about your fire safety plan book or even the fire code. It's about the building. We have to look at a sampling to see that the plan is being implemented. And it's about the people and the records. Do your staff know where to keep the records, where to find them? Does everyone know their responsibilities? Follow through and keep good records. I was in one building and the fire alarm records were in the fire alarm room. The generator records were in the generator room. All of the supervisory staff records were partially filled in and they were either in the super's logbook or in his computer, depending on what day he did which testing. And it became very, very difficult to accumulate all of those documents. You can imagine how hard that would be for staff in the event that the fire department comes to the building. It's important to keep this up to date, follow through, and keep good records. When you look at 70% of the time, the answer is no, we know that we have a problem with record management in most buildings. I took these pictures in different buildings. They're some of my favorites because it is amazing to me how you can look at some of these things and not realize there's a problem. But when people aren't trained to look for fire code compliance issues or potential failures in fire equipment, then they're not readily apparent when they're walking through their building. When you look at the door, for example, it was a super who replaced the deadbolt with a fire-rated locking handset on the service door. That's exactly what he was asked to do. Obviously never dawned on him to ask somebody what to do about the hole that he left where the deadbolt originally was. It was a super that explained to me that somebody had added an on-off switch in the fire alarm control panel so he could turn off the underground fire alarm zones when he power washed the garage. Does this look like a ULC approved installation to you? Well, I can tell you it was definitely done by somebody who knows something about fire alarm. I had to walk by this fire department connection at the face of the building to go into the management office. The super later said he did not know keeping fire department connections clear and checking them was part of his job. But everybody walking by these fire department connections missed that. When a resident complains about smoke or odor migration multiple times, you need to investigate. I took this picture in a kitchen 10 seconds after we started our diagnostic smoke migration testing in the adjoining unit. How fast do you think a fire would have spread into this suite if it had not been corrected? This was only one of 3 areas determined to be deficient and permitting migration into the suite. Fire separations are required within the fire code. They're required to be established in the building code, maintained in the fire code. If your people don't take care of these things, the fire department will. Staff with regular training learn to recognize and address deficiencies, system anomalies, and listen to learn to complaints about odor migration before somebody calls the fire department. Fire code compliance is complex. We discussed changes to the fire code, standards, building implementation, typical deficiencies, the need for training, record management, and professional annual review. So what can you do? Investing in your fire code compliance will reduce costs and reduce risks. Whether you need a building fire safety assessment, whether you have an antiquated fire alarm system that maybe needs upgrading, or maybe you want to add automated emergency voice to your systems, possibly have fire safety plan implementation reviews or training, you can prevent enforcement. In a 5-year annual fire code program, we created and conducted and tracked in 11 residential buildings that included annual review of a snapshot of the building, record reviews of all of their documents, staff refreshers on their fire safety plan, and fire drill training. We found a 10 to 30% reduction in deficiencies per year, and cumulatively, all 11 buildings had less than 3% deficiencies by year 5. One of the buildings had none. Part 7, misunderstanding and documentation, is an ongoing problem. Supervisory staff training is often missing. Fire department regular inspections are resulting in inspection orders. We're seeing enforcement because many buildings have not achieved and have difficulty maintaining comprehensive fire code compliance. There is a substantial increase in both fires and fire inspections, resulting in notices of violations and inspection orders. Most were not addressed promptly, will be pursued and end up before a court. This can result in tremendous amounts of time, money, and can result in fines from the thousands to millions of dollars for a second or subsequent offense. There have been a progressive increase in fine amounts and a number of parties being charged. I have inspection orders for good, well-maintained buildings on my desk that are pages long with multiple infractions, rarely related to your service company records, but that are directly related to your building staff's part. It should not take a notice of violation to ensure a building is in good fire code shape. We track building fires all the time, and there are way more than you hear about in the news. Enforcement is part of keeping us all safe. Proactive, all-encompassing evaluations and training is essential to truly understand the unique nature of your buildings. Training must be customized to your unique buildings and properties and should be sustainable. Part 2 of the Fire Code requires a record of supervisory staff training to be maintained at the building. On-site training is preferable in each category: fire safety plan implementation, record management, fire drills, quarterly Part 7 testing, and still being performed. However, virtual training is fast becoming a form of training we are conducting, still customized to the building, but recordable for others and to be used for new staff and refreshed ongoing staff training. Staff need to know how to evaluate their building deficiencies, what they're looking for, and what their responsibilities are. When they don't, they're not prepared for a fire department inspection or a real fire event. We've seen a substantial amount of violations for Part 7 of the Fire Code. Where a building does not have a test and procedure for integrated system testing of smoke control, elevators, emergency voice systems, and quarterly testing, a notice of violation is issued. In more than 50 buildings, our specialty engineer conducted this process and procedure development, practical testing, and supplemental fire safety plan documentation and training. Over 95% of the buildings failed one or more of the system's testings. Why is this happening? One of the buildings that I attended, we had 5 people helping with the process. We had the mechanical company there, the fire alarm company there, and the door company there. With an actual pulling of a pull station to see how all of those systems worked in a Part 7 integrated fashion, the smoke control included pressurization of the stairwells of the elevators, and that worked, but the doors at the bottom of the stairs did not open. Later, we found the door mechanisms had been disabled. We found that the corridor systems were supposed to shut down during a fire event, but there were 2 of them. One shut down, one didn't. This is mechanical. The elevators did recall, which is great, functioned properly, but during a later test, when the pressurization was adjusted and the pressure was increased in the building, the elevators wouldn't properly operate under emergency control. We have to test these systems, ensure they're working, and where repairs are conducted, test them again to ensure those buildings are functioning properly. So in one building, we had repairs to mechanical, repairs to the fire alarm, and repairs to the door. That's 3 different contractors having to ensure that this is working properly. 95% failure is not acceptable, and this is the first time Part 7 has been implemented in this way. Although it's been in the code for a while, each of those companies are testing their own systems in their own way, but this integrated testing is essential to make sure everything's working together. The original Part 7 Fire Code test protocol development and the quarterly Part 7 ongoing testing and inspection is not generally part of many buildings' annual contractor services. Differing contractors generally test their own equipment individually. The pressure testing required in stairwells, elevator operations, timing of doors and how they operate, keys, etc., and emergency integration testing is specialized and requires a coordinator and various service providers. This testing is not part of your annual fire alarm inspection requirements. It can be included after the protocols are developed and signed off by an engineer. The CFA, Canadian Fire Alarm Association, the association that manages fire code compliance as it pertains to testing, inspection of systems, and documentation, you'll see your service providers use their reporting for their annual testing, and it states in the red highlighted area that you're looking at that the testing did not include actual operational testing. They do test it electronically, make sure all of the right zones go on or off, but actual operational testing is not required as part of the CFAA S536 annual test standard. After a qualified engineer prepares the test procedure, witnesses the testing, deficiencies are addressed and rectified by appropriate contractors, and retesting confirms the performance, the protocols can be signed off and stamped. The supplemental guideline forms part of the fire safety plan. Staff have to be trained on how to continue the procedures quarterly, and the documents and training must be easy to follow. Part 7 is complex. Many of the sites we attend, we find that the staff are not familiar with how to conduct or supervise the quarterly testing. And often, the Part 7 documents are not easy for staff to follow. Make sure the firm you use to create your Part 7 documents includes engineering preparation, training, and simplified documents for your staff to follow. Once completed, your service providers and staff can often meet the quarterly requirements. In complex buildings, Managers often prefer to have the testing conducted with the consultant until staff are fully versed on this process. In addition to the staff instructions, a diagram of the functionality of the Part 7 requirements is imperative. A schematic should be prepared, specified to the building, that depicts smoke control configuration. Many buildings are configured completely differently, and it's imperative that the fire department know what configuration they're looking at when they come into a building. In the example shown, Stair C has dampers at the bottom of the stairwell. Other buildings may have them at the top of the stairwell or on select floors. Your staff may have moved from one building to another or been trained on a new or an older building, and they need to know exactly where these configurations are, which systems are pressurized and not, and how to ensure that they're tested properly by your contractor and during their quarterly inspections. These collective documents and staff training form sustainable compliance documentation. One of the tests I attended had dampers within the mezzanine that opened during fire alarm to vent the area, or they were supposed to. Out of 4 vents, 2 failed. One failed electronically. It did not open. The other failed functionally as the louvers stuck in a partially open position. Regular testing and maintenance prevents failures. We've talked about fire code compliance, changing continually. Fire code enforcement is also evolving to a preventative approach. Proactive enforcement is here to stay. Bill 100 received royal assent in May 2019. The maximum potential fine per count before Bill 100 was $50,000 for an individual and $100,000 for a corporation, still a substantial amount of money. But as of Bill 100, the maximum fines have increased up to $500,000 for a first offense and a maximum of $1.5 million for subsequent offenses. These are per count, and the fire code is the minimum standard. So we want to ensure compliance, not paying fines, and work to be completed. This increase to fines is now included in the Fire Protection and Prevention Act, or FPPA as it's often referred to. This is your fire code. When you invest in compliance and prevention, it should never cost you in defense or fines. Who's being charged when you don't have those top 5 deficiencies we talked about, or your Part 7 documentation and compliance? Everybody. We're seeing an upward trend to charge anyone with care and control of a building. As we discussed earlier, the fire code considers all with care and control to be owners under the scope of the fire code responsibilities. So we're seeing corporations, property managers, boards of directors, even individuals named in many violations. The corporations often include the corporation of the building and the management company as well. Many inspections and tests were missed in the shutdown of COVID-19. This was unavoidable. However, in a few of the buildings I watch over, we had superintendents affected, security affected, and others having to self-isolate due to exposure. If you did miss a step, check your records and catch up now. Minute any delays in service provider or staff inspections, and have a continuity plan developed to ensure training, alternate staff, and emergency procedures can be swiftly enabled as needed. Managers must pivot and ensure they're meeting all obligations of the fire code. Being aware of the primary deficiencies, the need for fire code compliance reviews, and the increased risks due to fires and insurance increases, COVID brought to the forefront the need for sustainable compliance, virtual and repeatable training, and the necessity to keep your buildings and your people safe. In an all-state report, they noted an increase in fire claims by 333%. That's substantial and significant. This fire could have had a different outcome had the building not had a fire code compliance program. Our team had recently conducted a fire code compliance review in this building. It included implementation review of their fire safety plan, a fire safety drill and review, additional training just before they had a fire during COVID. The manager stated after the fire event that the staff were prepared and staff, residents, and building performed effectively. And even though a full evacuation was undertaken and mandated by the fire department, the manager was proud to say it was conducted in a COVID-compliant manner. People spaced themselves as they went down the stairs, and there were no injuries. Everything went well. Proof of the success of regular fire code compliance initiatives. This is a really, really good story. Fire code compliance, maintenance, enforcement. The fire code is the minimum standard. Compliance is achievable and sustainable. The fire code is always changing as we learn more about fires, their causes, their risks. The fire marshal's office investigates deaths and major events to make sure the fire code suits our changing buildings today. We are continually learning and evolving to safeguard against loss of property or worse, loss of life from fire. This has created a comprehensive approach to fire safety, maintaining fire code compliance, having staff trained on fire safety plan implementation, and being prepared for fire department inspections results in mitigating risks and keeping your buildings and your people safe. You are not expected to be fire code experts. You may need help from your service providers and professionals. Reach out. We're here to help. The fire code's complex, but it's easy to put a plan in place that suits your building, your staff, availabilities, your budgets, and the complicated systems that you have or the simple systems that you have. This is about life safety. Compliance is achievable through good planning, training, and fire code reviews. Let's change this circle by maximizing compliance and fire code maintenance and reduce enforcement. Make sure your story is one of the good ones. Thank you. I recently did a series of webinars for the Canadian Condominium Institute. We had several questions, a lot, where do we start? Or we think we're really in good fire code compliance, so how do we know where the gaps are? It's simple. You simply get started by looking at your fire safety plan, all of your records, and see if everything seems to fit and make sense to you. One of the questions that I got recently at a session was, what is one of the most complex fire code challenges property managers and buildings are facing right now? Most fire departments have returned to doing regular inspections, and we are seeing an increase in the number of notices of violation. Some of these include smoke control and standpipe changes, but many include items that are your supervisory staff's responsibility for having an improved fire safety plan and training your staff on their responsibilities. It's pretty simple. Once they feel fully confident in what they're doing, and once you determine what's being done by a contractor and what's being done by the staff, that supervisory staff training can be utilized to ensure that they know their responsibilities. Reviewing these things together goes a long way to ensuring your building's in compliance to avoid notices of violations. Some buildings have had contractors start to check things like fire doors, suite doors, fire separations. Although some companies don't want to pay their fire alarm service company the dollars that they have to pay them to do those types of simplistic inspections. They can be done by an outside company, they can be done by supervisory staff, by superintendents, by property managers. There's a lot of ways that you can comply. It's not that difficult. It's a matter of really breaking down those responsibilities, ensuring what's done by a contractor, what's being done by staff, and communicating to your occupants. Do they know what your systems are? Do they know where they're located? In many cases, we get calls from people asking whether they're supposed to have a fire alarm system or not, or whether that device in their unit or their office is connected to the fire alarm, and whether they're supposed to test it, or whether that's to be tested by property management. It's pretty simple. That should be communicated, not on page 32 of their leasehold agreement or their purchase and sale agreement, but probably right there up front and center. Fire safety is one of the biggest important things in a building. Fire is one of the biggest risks in a building. The best thing to do is make sure you communicate who's responsible for what and review it regularly to make sure that it's being done. We have some great compliant buildings, and that's because they've taken these steps and they review them year after year. You wouldn't want somebody to perform first aid on you that did their training 5 years ago. So let's not have those critical people in your building that are taking care of millions of dollars worth of assets or just your home not getting the training that they need on a regular basis to ensure you're in fire code compliance. Another question we get asked is, does everybody need to do all of these things? The answer is no. The code applies to different buildings depending on their size, their scope, how tall they are, how many units they have, whether they're residential, commercial, whether they're a hospital or some sort of a care facility. The code is pretty broken down to ensure if you are a warehouse or a manufacturer, there's a section of the code that applies to you. That's what we want to make sure is in your fire safety plan and everybody trained to maintain things properly. I know this is a lot of information. I'm sure you have lots and lots of questions. I'm looking forward to hearing them, and we'll answer as many as we can now. And certainly, if you have other questions, reach out to our team, and we'd be happy to help you with them. But today, I'd like to ask you to go home, look at your fire safety plan, look at your fire code rules and regulations. Are you seeing any gaps? Do you need any help, or can you manage this on your own? Getting fire code compliant today will stop that enforcement tomorrow. Thanks again.